Hey guys, it's Liv here, and in today's video, I want to tier every single Fire-type Pokemon in competitive Pokemon. So if you guys enjoy this type of content and you want to see more like it, leave a like below and subscribe for more. And with that said, for anyone who might have been clicking on this as their first tiering video that I've done a few of these, with the playlist being really just everywhere. I'll put it in the description, I'll put it at the end, etc. But for anyone who this might be their first one, let me explain how I've been doing my tiering recently. So, for S+ Pokemon, these are Pokemon that define even like their Ubers tiers, or for VGC specifically, these are like top 5, 10 Pokemon, because VGC doesn't really have an Ubers, but these are Pokemon that like consistently are like controlling that metagame. For S tier, these are for Pokemon that are still really good. They're not necessarily, you know, the top 5, 10 Pokemon in their meta, but they're still Pokemon you typically see, especially as far as the ladder metas go, Ubers, or just in general for VGC. You'll also see some of the best OU Pokemon in this ranking, like for example, if we were doing ground and you saw Landorus Therian. Landorus Therian would probably be S rank because it's one of, if not the best Pokemon in OU. For A tier, these are Pokemon that are literally only Ubers because they were banned to the tier. They are top tier UU Pokemon, or they're Pokemon that are pretty decent but not necessarily meta defining in the OU tier. For B tier, it's for Pokemon that are pretty bad in OU but they're there by usage, okay in UU, or for Pokemon that are pretty amazing in like a lower tier sort of setting. C tiers for Pokemon that are decent in lower tiers. D tiers for Pokemon that are either really top tier in PU, maybe they're like banned to like NUBL, or they're just better than F tier. And then for F tier, of course, these are for Pokemon that are literally only there because they suck, but they're fully evolved. So with that said, let's start off with our first Pokemon being Charizard. Now Charizard's a PU Pokemon this generation. It's a pretty decent one if I remember correctly, but even still, it's definitely not F tier bad. F tier bad would be literally the Pokemon that like are untiered in my personal opinion. But Charizard's definitely usable. It's a pretty good Pokemon in VGC, though that's for another form, which we will be tiering separately, because unlike something like a Venusaur, for example, where you can still use Venusaur without maxing it, Charizard has to be maxed, so it's pretty near inviolable in 99.9% of games. There will always be that 0.1%, but it's such a rarity that even as someone who has used non-maxed Charizard in VGC in like a single individual match or two, because I just maxed something else on accident, I can safely say that even while I still didn't necessarily bomb the match, you pretty much do need to always max this Pokemon. It is very unusable without it. With that said though, next up we have the Charizard Megas. These are both honestly A tier Pokemon. They're pretty average in OU as far as Megas go. It's really just the fact that there are a lot of other Megas that are just better. Stuff like Mawile, Lopunny, Mega Lottie, etc. Even Mega Garchomp as far as the Dragon goes for Megazord X. And then as far as Fire types go, there aren't really a lot of top tier Fire type Megas, but these are not bad options if you want to look for a Mega. Charizard X is a really good breaker, and Charizard Y is really good for, well, it's a really good special breaker, but Charizard X I think is a really good immediate like actual breaker, because you're going to set up a Sword Dance to shatter a lot more common Pokemon in OU this generation, because between your stabs and Earthquake, you actually hit a lot of the meta really well. Charizard Y, on the other hand, really just relies more so on 4 attack sets, or maybe 3 attacks roost. The point being is that they're both fine Pokemon, they're just not really defining it here. And that's perfectly fine. Our next Pokemon, though, actually quite literally defines G-Max Pokemon as a whole, being G-Max Charizard. This is actually our first S+ Pokemon. This is a Pokemon that even as far as when G-Max was banned to Ubers before it got banned from the tier, this was still a pretty viable Pokemon actually, despite how many other box arts were running around the tier. And it's a Pokemon that's so good actually that you could even rare times find it running around Anything Goes. However, if I remember correctly, this was actually like a niche Pokemon as far as Anything Goes. But it's still a Pokemon you could technically end up making working in the tier actually. Because if we look at G-Max Charizard as far as anything, actually they don't tier the G-Max Pokemon. I could have sworn they did, but maybe they don't anymore. The point being though is that you could still actually probably pull this off as far as an Anything Goes tiering goes. Because looking at the meta, a lot of the tier would probably end up getting crippled in tandem with using Groudon outside, of course, with the combination of stabs plus Dragon move. It would hit a lot of Pokemon pretty well. Scorching Sand could probably be your 4th move if you wanted, because it's more accurate than something like a Focus Blast. As far as VGC goes, though, this is one of the best, if not the best, G-Max Pokemon you could actually run. The only things that would actually compete with it would be G-Max Rillaboom and G-Max Venusaur. However, the difference is that you don't run those Pokemon because you want to run a G-Max. You run them because they're really good Pokemon. Charizard, though, you run because it's a G-Max, and it is a terrifying one in tandem with Groudon. So I think this is pretty much a clear-cut S+ in my personal opinion. If you disagree, comment below. I know that one might be an actual hot take, but all my VGC players will know. Next is Ninetales, pretty terrible. As far as sunsetting goes, this is really the only option you have in low tiers, but if I remember correctly, Drought's actually banned in low tiers anyway. Ninetales is still pretty terrible. I would honestly just not really run this Pokemon ever. We have Arcanine up next. I think Arcanine's a pretty solid C tier Pokemon. I wouldn't act like, you know, Arcanine is the best Pokemon or anything, but it's not a bad NU Pokemon. Intimidate's really good on it, obviously. Heavy Duty Boots is still really amazing as an item goes. And I think you could definitely make a lot work with this Pokemon. It's like a budget Incineroar, though you have a benefit of not being fighting weak, which is pretty useful in niche situations against stuff like Zacian, for example, because Incineroar does have to worry about that. However, you do miss out on a pretty big thing as far as VGC goes, because you're not resistant to Calyrex, and that is pretty much more. That's actually probably worse than the benefit of checking Zacian a little bit better, because Incineroar does still check it pretty well after an Intimidate. The point being, though, is I don't think this Pokemon's really that great, so we're going to tier it that way. Next up, though, we do have the Hisuian Arcanine. So, as far as Hisuian Arcanine goes, I can't lie, this one's a really weird one for me, actually, because Hisuian Arcanine, I don't really think it's that good on paper. However, at the very least, Hisuian Arcanine does have a few things going for it. The offensive fire rocket typing is actually pretty good as far as doubles goes. We've seen that work with Colossal, for example. However, that's mostly because of Steam Engine, and this Pokemon, I think, would pretty much have to be locked into a Choice Scarf role, considering that would really be the best way you could actually take advantage of, you know, flinching with Rock Slide, for example. It's not bad because it does Intimidate. Inherently, that means it's at least kind of usable, but at the same time, though, I think this is probably just a D tier Pokemon. This could be a really cool Pokemon as far as like an NU tiering goes, and I don't think it's going to be like Magcargo bad, because it has an actual speed tier to work with, and it could be a really good offensive Scarfer. However, I'm not really convinced this will be anything actually prevalent. 4 times weakness to ground is never a good thing. The fact this has no real coverage for stuff like ground types, such as rock types, which is also weak to rocks, which is another issue. It just misses out on a lot of things that made Arcanine really good, to be fair. However, I will say that this could have the potential, once it's introduced into Scarlet and Violet, to be a better Pokemon, but currently I'm not convinced. I think it's just a worse Arcanine, so I'm going to tier it that way. Next up, we have Alolan Marowak. This is definitely a C tier Pokemon in my opinion. I will say, though, I rate it a little bit above Arcanine. Not that I think it's a ton better necessarily, but this is definitely a really good breaker as far as lower tiers go, like the RU tier, for example. It's not terrible at VGC on Trick Room, however, there are definitely better options, such as Torkoal. So, I think it's definitely not a bad Pokemon, personally. You can even see cases of this being rarely ran in Trick Room and OU, but Trick Room is such a niche thing there. It's literally like one of the most niche cheese playstyles you could run, besides maybe like, I don't know, maybe like a Hail. Well, not Hail. Hail actually has gotten really good in OU. Maybe like a Sun team would probably be up there, but even still, I think it's less niche than Trick Room at this point. The point being is that Alolan Marowak is very niche in OU. It's still not terrible though, but it's a pretty good RU Pokemon, so I'd say that Alolan Marowak can get the C tier. Magmortar. Magmortar's a Pokemon, I know I said I wasn't going to tier any NFEs, but I'm tiering Magmortar specifically because it wasn't intended to be an NFE on its introduction, so I think it deserves to at least be mentioned here as all. It's still a pretty bad Pokemon, but I mean, Mortar at the very least has some things going for it. For example, you can run a Violet with Flame Body, and it's not terrible defensively, actually. Once you throw the Violet on it, you can maybe go for burns. It has a better speed tier than Magmar, actually, by 10 base, which is pretty good. You could potentially run Belly Jumps on this as well. However, if you're running a Violet, you do miss out on the Berry. I don't think this Pokemon's great, but I think it at least deserved to be mentioned was all. Next up, though, we do have Flareon. And I'll be honest, Flareon's another one where I'm a little bit unsure. I think it's definitely better than Ninetales, but it's still honestly probably an F tier Pokemon, which sadly a lot of fire types are going to end up in this tier, in my opinion. They're not really that great. Flareon sadly misses out on having an actual speed tier. But if you give this thing either A, a stat priority option, which sadly fire doesn't really have any, or B, if you give it like 95 speed, this could have honestly probably been a good C tier Pokemon, like a really good C tier Pokemon actually. But sadly, having a 95 special attack instead of the 95 speed really does hurt this Pokemon's viability a lot. So we're going to put Flareon in F tier. Next up, though, we do have Moltres. This is probably our first B tier Pokemon, actually. Moltres is a pretty good defogger as far as lower tiers go. Even sees some usage time to time in OU, depending on the stall it's built on. But Moltres is typically just one of those really good, like, slightly below OU Pokemon, in my opinion, especially with Boots being introduced. But you could even see this going back as far as Gen 7, where this was actually occasionally ran on the UU stall, in tandem with Articuno, weirdly enough. But, yeah, the point being, though, is that Moltres, I think, is a really good defensive fire type. if you're thinking defensive fire types this generation, I think you're really thinking of Moltres at this point. If not Ho-Oh and Ubers, but we'll get into Ho-Oh in a bit. The point being, though, is I think that Moltres regular is definitely a B tier Pokemon. Next up, though, we do have Typhlosion. Typhlosion's honestly a D tier Pokemon. I think this is worse Charizard at this point, which is weird to say because I think if you asked me last generation, I would have put them in a whole different tier, with Typhlosion being a whole tier, if not 2 tiers above. But I think with Boots, Charizard definitely ends up taking the cake as far as the Charizard stat line Pokemon that you're going to really run on as an offensive fire in low tiers. Because despite having Flash Fire and able to boost your eruptions that way, I think in Charizard just having Boots and being able to Sun Boost as well, which both these Pokemon kind of do to be fair, but Charizard having Solar Power I think is more valuable than Typhlosion having Flash Fire and hoping the opponent hits you with a Fire type move. So I think they're both D tier Pokemon, but I think that Charizard is definitely the better one. Now as far as Hisui and Typhlosion goes, this is another weird one. I'll be honest, I think this is definitely worse, but I think you could make a case that this Pokemon would end up being better. Currently though, this Pokemon has absolutely no moves to really work with as far as competitively speaking goes. So I'm not really sure where I actually want to tier it, I'll be honest. But I don't know. I think that Typhlosion Hisui is a really weird one. But if we look at its moveset, for example, it's mostly a physical Pokemon. However, it has Focus Blast. I didn't realize it had Focus Blast. Oh, you know what? It was if I remember correctly, it was missing out. Yep, it's missing out on a special ghost. Oh, you know, no. So the Focus Blast, yeah, that's actually wrong. Focus Blast was a Typhlosion thing. It's just integrating Typhlosion's base moveset. Yep, I knew it didn't have an actual like fighting type move for dark types. Yeah, this Pokemon is pretty terrible. I don't think it's F tier terrible necessarily because it still has a pretty good stat line. It's not a terrible Scarfer with just stabs alone. It could be a not bad one, but you'd be pressed to see me put this any higher than actual Typhlosion in my opinion. But I think D tier is pretty fine. As I said, if it wasn't for the fact that this has 119 special attack and 95 speed, and Fire Ghost is still a pretty good offensive typing, just has no coverage really. It's a big thing. But Cargo, F tier. I think it's worse than Magmar, and I'll be honest, this is gonna be the lowest Pokemon we rank on the tier today. But yeah, it's terrible. Houndoom gets a D tier. I'll be honest, it's mostly just because Fire Dark typing is really good offensively. But it's definitely gonna be like our weakest. Actually, no, it'll be above Hisui Typhlosion. That's our new entry barrier for D tier. It needs to be better than Hisui Typhlosion. But Fire Dark isn't really that great, offensively speaking. However, at the same time though, Houndoom does have a lot going for it at the very least, considering the fact that, you know, it's really fast. Even as priority if you want to run it physically, however, wouldn't really recommend that. The point being though is Houndoom sucks. But our next Pokemon is actually pretty good. We have Mega Houndoom. Mega Houndoom has a lot going for it. The Sun Boost and Solar Power, as I mentioned, just like with Zard, is really good. It's a lot faster than Zard 2 at 115, and having a better dual type offensively speaking, in my opinion, especially when you're not limiting your flying type stab with Hurricane in the Sun being 50% accurate. Whereas Typhlosion on a Houndoom Mega doesn't have to worry about that because Dark Pulse doesn't get limited like that. Not only this, but as far as fairies go, you have super effective coverage. As far as waters go, you Solar Beam, which Zard does have too, to be fair. But even still, this can get away pretty easily with just running a 4-attack set and going wild. You have Nasty Plot to boost your stats really quickly, which is really helpful if you're not running a Sun team. However, Sun does help this thing more immediately break through opponents. The point being is that Typhlosion Mega on a Houndoom Mega is actually really amazing. I don't know why I keep calling this Pokemon Typhlosion, but I will probably do it another 5 times. The point being is this is a pretty good C tier Pokemon in my personal opinion. Next up, we do have Entei. Entei's again another interesting one. I feel like we keep running into pretty interesting Pokemon here. I don't think this is necessarily a ton better than Charizard, but I think definitely speaking that this has competition issues with stuff like Arcanine, for example, which can not only run the bulkier sets better, but it can also, in my opinion, run Bandit sets a little better, just because you get a lot better coverage with Arcanine. So I'm going to put Entei in D, but I think this will probably be our new definer for the top of D tier, in my opinion. Ho-Oh's up next. Ho-Oh's definitely going to be an S+ Pokemon. I'll be honest. I think that the entry barrier for S tier for Ubers is going to be pretty slim. We'll probably only have like 1 or 2 Pokemon in the S tier. But a lot of fire type Ubers either are pretty lackluster or are pretty amazing. And Ho is definitely no exception. Ho actually, I think I'll rank up. No, I'm going to rank it below actually. And I think it's purely for the fact. Well, no, never mind. Because in literally any meta game besides doubles, Ho is better. It just doubles Zard is better. So I'm going to put Ho above. With Regen and Boots this generation, this is an absolutely terrifying Pokemon to KO. You can typically switch this Pokemon in and out and check nearly anything if it doesn't have a rock type move or like a physical water type move, which is a rarity as far as the tier goes. The only exceptions would be Pokemon like Kyogre and Primal Kyogre, but typically you can make this Pokemon check nearly anything. So I gotta give it the S+. Next up though, we have Blaziken. Blaziken's definitely gonna be an S tier Pokemon. I will say that I realize this Pokemon is not even in the OU tier as far as Sword and Shield goes, but I don't actually think that matters, because I think that what Blaziken brings to the table on paper is pretty terrifying. In my personal opinion, when you start bringing this Pokemon into the same context as Pokemon like Megazards, I think this offers a lot more actually to the discussion. For example, Blaziken, while it isn't necessarily an OU legal Pokemon, well, it's not even an OU banned Pokemon in that dex, it still is in the banned tier for UU, and with stuff like Z-Moose, for example, is a pretty terrifying Pokemon with speed boost. Actually, I'll put regular Blaziken in A tier, because I did also mention that for Pokemon that were in Ubers, this is for lackluster Pokemon in Ubers, and this is an Ubers Pokemon on BDSP and it runs wild there. I think that this is definitely better than the Zards at the very least, even if it's not in the OU tier. However, I do think that at the very least this will help give better distinction for Mega Blaziken, which is an outright S Pokemon. Mega Blaziken is just the better version of Blaziken. In my opinion, I think that while last gen Life Orb boost would have been a little bit more valuable, I think the immediate boost is really useful, and especially when you consider the fact that this has a U-turn now. If you're not trying to commit to a sweep, you can pivot out, and ultimately it's just being faster than Blaziken helps you get off that +1 U-turn a little bit better, because with Blaziken, you really need to get the +2 speed to pull that off, whereas in Mega Blaziken, you'll outpace enough Scarfers at +1 to where you could actually pull it off pretty easily in my opinion. So I think Mega Blaziken is a little bit better at that role. It's more immediately offensively potent, so you can run Protect 3 attack sets and not worry as much about trying to 2-hit KO Pokemon with that. So yeah, in my opinion, I think that Mega Blaziken is definitely an S tier. I think Blaziken is just top of A. Camerups up next. Camerup is definitely an F tier. However, at the very least, I think it's better than Magmar and Magcargo because Ground is slightly better offensively than Sylphic Rock, for example. So I'm going to put it in the F tier still. Mega Camerupt, though, honestly, I'm giving this the top of C tier. Mega Camerupt is an amazing trigger Pokemon. It's one of those few really low tier Pokemon that can actually come up and check certain Ubers even. And I'm talking Pokemon like Magearna. This actually ends up being one of those go-to Pokemon if you're looking for a Magearna check and it's not Heatran. Because currently, Heatran actually can get checked by Magearna, but Magearna isn't really going to run Water Pulse for Mega Camerupt. So typically, it gets checked by Mega Camerupt. Not only this, but it's also a really good tricker Pokemon. As far as Natex goes, it's just the better job of what a little Marowak brings to the table. In my personal opinion, Mega Camerupt is actually probably better than Mega Houndoom as far as performing in upper tiers goes. But you can make the case that it isn't, and I think it's also as valid. They're both pretty good, to be honest. But personally, I do rate Mega Camerupt a little bit better than Mega Houndoom goes. Neither are really terrible Megas, though, and I think if you were to really go with either Mega, you're not really, shooting yourself in the foot or anything, because you're going to get a lot out of both Pokemon, just very different roles in my personal opinion. But regardless, though, I do think that they're both pretty good. I just think that Mega Camerupt is slightly better, personally. Next up, though, is Torkoal. Torkoal, while this is definitely like a C-tier Pokemon as far as singles goes, I think its doubles rating puts it in like the S+ category. Well, not the S+, definitely like the S or A category. So I'm going to put it in B. I'm going to put it at the top of B, though. This is a really good UU Pokemon, even. Well, I don't know if it's really good, to be honest. I've never really seen Torkoal in UU. I just know that it is in the UU tier, but it's definitely a good Pokemon nonetheless. Whether you're talking singles or doubles, it's a good Rapid Spinner, it's a good Weather Setter. Fire typing on the slow Pokemon is amazing, especially when you've run this in doubles with Trick Room. This can get off Specs Eruptions or Charcoal Eruptions very easily. And if you're not a Resist, you're probably going to actually die to the hit unless you're some special behemoth like a Blissey. So I think Torkoal's really good this gen. This is probably the best gen Torkoal's ever really had, to be honest. Especially with the addition of Body Press, it's pretty good as far as defensive variants go. So yeah, Heavy Duty Boots also helps a lot in singles with this Pokemon keeping rather long-term actual usage, because if you're going to think of Torkoal, while Heat Rock does give you 3 more turns per bring-in, with the Heavy Duty Boots you can bring this in several times, because unless you get knocked off, you can just switch this in and switch it back out. So I think Torkoal definitely does end up preserving the B tier in this gen, in my personal opinion. Next about Primal Groudon. If you've ever played Pokemon, you know this is an S+ category. I don't need to go into Primal Groudon to justify this. It does everything, and it does everything really well. Defensive, offensive, it can pretty much be tailored to check nearly every Pokemon besides like Arceus Ground and Tiger Complete. And even still, people have found ways to check those Pokemon. So I think it just says a lot, or at the very least to soft check them on the immediate switch in. Because as far as Arceus Ground goes, people sometimes run stuff like Eruption or Solar Beam to get around that. And as far as Zyger Complete goes, people will even go as far as running Hintar Ice Groudon on this gen. So, or at the very least in that Nexus gen. So I do think there's actually merit to putting his Pokemon even in its own tier. But at the same time, I don't really want to devalue how good Charizard, G-Max, and Ho-Oh are. I do think that in their respective metagames, Ho-Oh just being in general for Ubers, whether Nat Dex or otherwise, and for Charizard being VGC this gen, I don't want to disrespect how good those Pokemon are in their metagames, but I do think you can make a case for like an S+ tier, well, S++ tier for Primal Groudon alone. It's one of those very few Pokemon that truly does define every metagame it touches. But with that said, we have Monferno time. Monferno I think is definitely better than at least the Camerupt, Magmar, Magcargo, but it's not a great Pokemon obviously. With the Violet and stuff like Slackoff and Will-O-Wisp, this has found defensive niches in the PU tier in past generations. It hasn't really had the chance to this gen because it just hasn't really been allowed in the generation that has had a Violet because BDSP cut it. That has really had an actual low tier format because Natdex peaks at like UU for example. So I think Monferno is still definitely better than stuff like Camerupt and all that, but it's still definitely in the F tier category for sure. Infernip, on the other hand, I think is probably going to be the top B. I can't really see a lot actually passing this in terms of B tier Pokemon. It's a pretty decent UU Pokemon as far as Infernip's viability goes. It's one of those Pokemon you will always see at least have a very, very, very niche presence in OU. However, it will never really end up topping the tier anymore unless your name is BDSPOU, because it's Gen 4 OU basically. Infernip though has a lot going for it as far as Scarf sets go, physically and specially based. It's really good at both options. Infernip has a really good speed tier at 108, pretty good for fire types because not a lot of fire types really have that strong of a speed tier. As we can see from the list below, most of these Pokemon don't actually outpace Infernip. It's really just Mega Houndoom at this point that actually would outpace it, and we don't get a lot of other options that do later on down the line. So I do think Infernip definitely deserves this list. It's one of those really few fast fire types you could point to that's also really good Scarfer, really good choice specs, really good band Pokemon, even defensive sets just like Monferno. This can pull them off in very niche situations. So with that said, I think B tier fits this Pokemon pretty well in my personal opinion. Next up though, we do have Mortar. So Mortar is another one of those like fringe PU Pokemon. I think it's better than Ninetales. Well, actually no, it's definitely worse than Ninetales. No, never mind, because this gets out its own sun. I think this is like just the top of F, I'll be honest. It's just better than Magmar to be honest. But it's pretty good with specs. It's not terrible with other sets like Life Orb, but it's just not great. Rotom Heat is definitely going to be a B tier Pokemon. I'm going to put it below Moltres. That might be a bit of a hot take, I'll be honest. But I think that Rotom Heat's actual like true shining moments in the tier have died personally. Might just be my personal opinion, but I don't really think that Rotom Heat's that great anymore. Actually, no, that's a lie. I'm going to put it above Moltres for the sole fact this actually does have very niche presence in VGC, considering there have been a couple metagames where this is a very niche Zacian check. But again, there are a lot better options. I think it's at least enough because I was pretty fringe on Moltres versus Rotom Heat as far as the tiering goes, and I think that one thing, and keep in mind this is a very slim, very niche thing it does, that one thing alone I think does actually give it usage, because unlike Moltres at the very least, Rotom Heat is a really good pivot and it can Pain Split to actually wear down other Pokemon it doesn't check as well. Whereas while Moltres does have recovery of its own, I think the Pain Splitting in bad matchups could be a little bit more useful. Albeit again, neither are great, and I think you could make a case to flip-flop either one. I will say as well that Rotom Heat is also better in BDSP, so I'll give it that over Moltres at the very least. Again, neither are great, but they're both pretty even with each other. Heatran's S tier, if not for the fact that this runs both Sword and Shield, all of BDSP, Sword and Shield, that XOU. It's one of the best Pokemon you could find in literally every single one of those tiers. And I think that the S rank it shows, in my personal opinion. This is one of those Pokemon, honestly, I think that Heatran started to enter the same conversations that Lane of T has entered, while not having the same extreme usage of 40 or 50%. Heatran is still definitely consistently in the 20 or 30 percentile, so I think that Heatran should be tiered pretty accordingly. We tiered Heatran, Landorus is an S tier, so why not tier Heatran in my opinion? This is a really good defensive option, really good choice specs option even, cool Scarfer. It's just a lot, and I really do think that Heatran's value in OU is pretty similar to Pedons and Ubers, or in Natdex in my personal opinion. So I want to give Heatran the S ranking. I think it really deserves it. Next up is Arceus Fire. Pretty garbage Arceus typing. You'll really never actually run this Arceus. At least you'll run Blaziken. I don't want to put it in A tier though, because while I did say that A tier was for Pokemon that I feel like no presence in Ubers and they're thereby tiering, Arceus is still, it still is an Arceus form. It has 120 all around. I really cannot justify putting an Arceus besides like maybe Bug in the A tier. And even still, I think that that'd be a pretty hard thing to justify as far as a general tier list goes. If this was like an Uber's tier list, I'd have no problems putting this like the F tier. But with that in mind, I really cannot justify putting an Arceus form in A tier, even if it borderline deserves it. But that might be personal bias. I think this Pokemon is one of the worst Arceus forms you can get. I think especially this gen, when you could throw boots on most defensive fire types, you cannot do that with an Arceus fire. This is still a hazard weak fire type, and unlike something like Megazord, it doesn't really bring a lot unique to the table. Besides, I guess the fact you can run Judgment plus Bolt Beam plus Recover and get pretty good coverage set out of it. That's really all you get from Arceus fire. But even still, there's a lot of other Arceus forms that do its job better. Even Arceus Ice, for example, with the stronger Judgment, which is a lot better super effective coverage than Fire Judgment does. I really don't think you could justify Fire. I personally even think it's actually worse than Arceus Ice, but it's a whole other discussion to be had. Next up though, Victini. Victini is going to be the top of A. I think this is a really amazing Pokemon as far as Series 13 meta goes. It's probably one of the better mythicals you could run. It's an amazing Pokemon in OU. It's a pretty good Pokemon in that next tier with Z Celebrate. However, it's not like a meta definer in that tier, and I also don't think it's a meta definer in VGC either. So, in fact, it's not really a meta definer in any tier it's in. It's just a really good Pokemon, and it exists to do really well. So I'm definitely going to put it in the top of A. This will probably be the highest Pokemon we get in the A tier. I can't imagine anything else actually breaking it. But with that said though, we do have Emboar up next. Emboar gets a solid D tier, but I'm going to put it above like Hisuian Arcanine and all that. Actually, no, I'm going to put this at the top of D. If we look back at tiers where Emboar has actually been a low tier Pokemon, for example, if we look back at, let's say, Gen 7, if I remember correctly, Emboar was an RU Pokemon in that NUBL. So this is a Pokemon that basically was banned from the NU, or banned from the NU tier to reside forever in RU borderline. Which, if nothing else, I do think it speaks of where Emboar would probably end up being this generation. It's a really good wall breaker with stuff like Reckless, for example, with Flare Blitz. It's pretty obnoxious to switch around a bandit set with this. And yeah, actually, no, that's a lie. I think Entei would be better. Entei is definitely better. But I still think it's better than Charizard, which is at least boots reliant. It's extremely boots reliant, unless you're going to take half with the spec set. But you'd need a really good wish Pokemon or an insane hazard removal for low tier to really pull that off. So I think Emboar is at least better than Zard. It's definitely not as good as Entei though. I think it'd be a crime actually putting Entei below, even if Entei is definitely a bit lackluster this gen to say the least. But yeah, I think it's still not bad. Simisear, definitely below Ninetales and Monferno, to be honest. Simisear is a cool 101 nasty plot Pokemon, but Ninetales has a lot of defensive utility they can also bring to the table. And Monferno, I think, can do, again, the offensive and defensive roles as well. Whereas Simisear is really just a glass cannon, and it doesn't even really do the job better than Ninetales, I'd say, because at 101 speed doesn't really make a huge difference in low tiers, because a lot of Pokemon hit like the 90 or 95 range down there. So I think it's still definitely worse because it does infinitely less jobs than either of these Pokemon do. Even though Ninetales has potential for Sun, even if it's banned where it's typically tiered. So I gotta give that to Ninetales at least. Darmanitan, this is definitely a really good B tier Pokemon, albeit I still think it's actually probably the lowest one here. Darm we've been typically seeing as generations have went on tier lower and lower, and currently it's actually a UU Pokemon, but it's one of those Pokemon I think could end up, it's one of those really fringe UU RU Pokemon typically. So I think that I gotta say that Darm does belong there. Now Darmanitan Zen, I wanted to tier both the Zen forms to be honest. Zen Galar I think is actually a pretty good one, albeit it's definitely the bottom of S for sure. Because it's a Pokemon that's really hard to actually pull off the drum sets, but it still is an absolute monster every time you pull it off. It's pretty much a guaranteed sweep in my personal opinion. As far as Zen Regular goes, I think this is honestly probably a really bad Pokemon. You really can't justify running this, however, it's still better than at the very least Magmar and Magcargo. I think the biggest thing would be if you could switch out and keep the Zen immediately after. This might have some merit because you could maybe wish pass into it, and I think at that point you might actually have an argument for like bottom of C, top of B, because you can pull off Trick Room sets pretty well. The stat line is actually pretty good on this Pokemon, and I think the one thing it's missing to actually take advantage of really staying in would be a reliable recovery move. Because if it had something like a Slack Off maybe, you could maybe make a case for this Pokemon being a C tier. But I think the other caveat is once it changes Zen, it would need to stay in Zen. If the ability worked like that, I think it would make a case for this form to actually be a really good C tier Pokemon, but it doesn't. So with that in mind, it's an F tier. It's just not as bad as Magcargo and Magmar. Heatmore's up next. Heatmore is definitely pretty bad. It's like worse than, actually it's probably better than Simisear. I think one thing that it has going for it is the fact that it's a physical fire type, which I do actually value more in fires because you can't really burn them. And not only that, but I think moves like Fire Lash, for example, are really actually pretty cool, considering you could just start using this like Thunderous Kick, Zapdos, and OU, and you could just start lowering defense, and run this on a Bandit set, or even just like a physical set with stuff like Knock Off and Sucker Punch. This is pretty good physical attack, and despite being slightly lower than special, I think physical sets are a little bit better for that reason, because you could just consistently make your physical attack do more and more just by attacking. Similar to how Superior will boost special attack more and more by attacking with Leaf Storm. So I think Heatmore is definitely better in that regard. Stuff like Gluttony is pretty cool in this Pokemon because you can run this with Citrus Berry. However, I think that Flash Fire is typically the option you'd run the most. The point being, though, is I do think this Pokemon is definitely at least better than Simisear. It's not a bad Pokemon, actually. Volcarona is a pretty good A-tier Pokemon, really amazing sweeper. I do think Victini is a slightly easier job sweeping as far as the role goes. But Volcarona is still actually not a bad Pokemon. Even if we were to tier, like, let's say, in terms of actual OU goes, they're both actually pretty consistently in the OU tier, or like lingering right around it. They're both not bad options. I think the Volcarona is slightly better in Sword and Shield. However, I think that as Natdex goes, Victini, in my personal opinion, is slightly better. However, again, I think you could really flip-flop either of these Pokemon and they'd both be pretty justifiable wherever you put them. Reshiram's up next. This is, again, another pretty not great Pokemon. Actually, I'm going to put Reshiram at the bottom of S tier for the sole reason that Reshiram is truly there because it's banned. However, I think Reshiram would be a lot, like, way too much in comparison to Pokemon like Victini, for example, because it's not Skyman bad necessarily, where it's literally only there because it's banned because of a mechanic, because Reshiram still has pretty good stats, and it's actually also not a bad Pokemon in VGC, so actually I am going to move it above Heatran. I'm going to move it above Arceus Fire too, because at least Reshiram has a meta where it's viable in, or not necessarily viable, but it's just usable in, because you can occasionally see Reshiram on Trick Room teams with stuff like Kali Ice, or just in general, you can maybe see it as like a cool breaker with Groudon. But again, it's not anything crazy, it just exists. Delphox is up next. I think Delphox is definitely the epitome of the bottom of D tier. It's definitely better than stuff like Entei, Emboar, etc. The typing is a lot better in my personal opinion, but it's nothing great. Talonflame, I'm going to give Talonflame top of C. It's a pretty cool Pokemon as far as, you know, going for Pranks or Tailwind in VGC, but it's significantly outclassed in the role. It's also not a bad Pokemon as far as low tiers go. You'll typically see Talonflame enter like the RU, NU sort of realm, but it's not a bad option in those tiers in my opinion. In fact, I think Talonflame outright outclasses Zard because of the priority Brave Bird alone. So yeah, I think that in my opinion, Talonflame's definitely, actually I'm going to put it above, I don't know, below like Arcanine. I think realistically these three just have a lot more than they offer and a lot more potential to rise in other tiers or be viable in tiers that they have no business being in. Specifically being for Arcanine UQ potentially, and for Marowak and Camerupt for OU potentially. So with that said, I'm going to put Talonflame right below these. Pyro's up next. Pyro's pretty terrible. It's definitely better than Simisear, but it's still worse than Heatmore in my opinion. You can't really get a lot of usage out of Pyro. In fact, I think the one thing that Pyro has going for it is the speed, which 106 speed is a little bit better than Simisear's is, so I'm going to tier it a little bit better. But I think the one thing, actually, no, I think Unnerve actually is pretty good, I can't lie. I forgot this thing actually got Unnerve. I was thinking it had Rivalry and Moxie as its only abilities, but Unnerve is a pretty good ability, it's actually. I think that at the very least, this might actually be the top of F. Yeah, I'm going to put this at the top of F. I think Unnerve alone actually is really good because you can't really just run a barrier to get around this, and it has some pretty strong attacks actually with stuff like Overheat, for example. It has stuff like Dark Pulse for coverage. You can run Wild Charge on Moxie too. So I'll give this top of F. Actually, no, I'll give it below Mech Mortar. Final answer, below Mech Mortar. Volcanion definitely gets right above Blaziken. It's a pretty cool Pokemon as far as doubles goes. You could check most common Kyogres. In fact, it's actually to such a degree you could handle Kyogre with this Pokemon that Kyogre will probably, in terms of doubles, have to start running Thunder for this, because you can actually take advantage of both weathers, because with Groudon, if you have Trick 'em Up, or if you just have a Scarf set, you could end up potentially taking advantage of the sun and completely blast past Groudon. Or with Kyogre, for example, you just absorb all the water hits, stuff like, for example, Water Spout, I was forgetting the move, or Origin Pulse, and completely just gain back HP with that. Not only this, but the typing is really good in OU. You can typically see this running more mixed, like defensive, offensive sets, or bulky offensive sets. And you could run this with Boots. It's typically pretty good on Hail teams. You'll see it with Arctozolt a lot. So yeah, I think this is a pretty good Pokemon personally. I think it's definitely probably the best gen Volcanion's ever had. Torcat, one of those NFE Pokemon I think that at least deserve to mention. With a Violet, it's not terrible. I think it's at least better than like Heatmore personally, but it's not great. Incineroar, definitely another S+ Pokemon. I think it's above Gmax Zard, still below the other two, just because the fact this is really only a VGC thing that it's so useful.
but it still is honestly amazing because these other two Pokemon, definitely in VGC when they've been allowed, still have really top tier usage, or at least Groudon did. Ho was kind of mixed, but it's still also a top tier Pokemon in several different Ubers metagames. With Incineroar, really, it's just VGC though, but it's still really good in that tier. So I think I gotta put it in S+ yet again. Or Corio's pretty terrible, but I think that if this was allowed this generation, it'd be just really cool with boots. You can make a case maybe for, I think, bottom of D, top of F. It's not terrible, it's just not great. Salazzle, pretty good low tier Pokemon actually. I'm gonna put it right below Mega Houndoom. But that's, again, this whole C tier actually could be pretty much shifted. These are all actually truly pretty equal with each other in my personal opinion now that I'm looking at it. There's not really, I think, a ton that's better or worse as far as this tier goes. But Salazzle's pretty good. It can poison Steel types, which is actually amazing as it is. However, it's Fire type, so it also doesn't really need to typically poison them outside of maybe like a Heatran, I guess. So it's really a mixed bag there. I think it was more deserving than literally any other Pokemon. Savali, as a Fire type, I think Fire is one of the worst types it has because similar to Arceus, it can't really run boots. I'm going to put this, actually I'm going to put it above Simisear, I think, just because, well actually above Heatmore. It still has momentum going for it, and it still has defog support going for it, and parting shot's pretty cool, but it's really not that great. Turtonator's pretty not bad. As far as like a Shell Smasher goes, that alone actually I think gives it usage. I'm going to put this at the top of F. Shell Smash alone with the mixed offenses it has is pretty good. However, sadly, with a +2 speed, you cannot even outpace Greninja with this. So that is actually a pretty terrible thing alone for it. Actually, it's either you just barely outpace Greninja or you just barely get outpaced by it. Either way, it's really terrible because most up-fast Pokemon, stuff like Koko, Dragapult, Zera, can all outpace this and pretty easily revenge it. So I gotta give it the F tier, but it still is actually probably better than everything in this tier, specifically because of Shell Smash. Rapidash is pretty terrible, but at the same time, it's probably better than Flareon, just because the speed and offenses alone that Rapidash provides is actually pretty good. You can run something like Flash Fire and Flame Body, both are pretty good abilities. You can run Swords and Senses pretty well, actually, and 100 offense and 105 speed is really good, actually. I think this is a pretty decent F tier Pokemon, but nothing insane. Blaziken's up next. This is a pretty good OU Pokemon, albeit it's, in my personal opinion, worse than stuff like these Zards, but maybe that might be a little bit of a hot take. I'm not really huge on this Pokemon, actually, personally, but I can't deny this Pokemon does have a really strong offensive presence as far as OU goes. It's one of those Pokemon that typically will at least be viable as far as an OU metagame goes, but again, I'm not really huge on this Pokemon. I think it's actually a little bit more overhyped than it deserves, but I think that tiering a Pokemon that is as usable as Blaziken is in OU, I know it's really good in its regular OU, but even still, if we look at other fire types, for example, Victini and Volcarona are both tiered in the same vein as it, and I think they're both actually better options, personally, despite, you know, they're all A- Pokemon. And as far as other Pokemon around here, Blaziken, I think at least that Blaziken has an Ubers meta that is viable in, being BDSP Ubers. That alone, I think, at least tiers it above Blaziken, albeit it's not really some top tier Ubers Pokemon, but it is viable, and it still has OU viability. And as far as Natdex tier goes, it's tiered in the same tier as Blaziken, and Pokemon such as Volcanion are tiered in the same tier, but are more viable, in my personal opinion, than in Sword and Shield OU. The Charizards are more viable in Natdex. We have stuff like Victini and Volcarona, which are also a lot more viable in Natdex. So I think I'm fine putting this at the bottom of A tier personally, but again, I think this is pretty contentious personally. You could really tier Blaziken anywhere, and I think it makes sense. But I personally do think among these, it is the worst. Next up is Cinderace Gmax. Cinderace Gmax actually will get the S tier. Just blanket S, but I'm going to put it below. Actually, I'm going to put it above Speed Blaziken. Oh, Mega Blaziken. Mega Blaziken's a bit of a more niche Pokemon as far as Ubers goes, but it's at least more usable because of Baton Pass when it's been allowed than Reshiram and Arceus Fire. Cinderace, though, with the Gmax form is actually a pretty terrifying monster, but I think that Zard, as a Gmax specifically, I think Zard outclasses it, but Cinderace belongs to a lot more of a potent offensive Pokemon, so I think you could make a case maybe that Irie's Pokemon could be S+, but I think the difference is that Zard Gmax runs VGC, and Cinderace has actually fallen off a lot in terms of VGC. Cinderace similarly though, I'm going to put it in S. They're both pretty even. I'm just going to put the Gmax above because Gmax does more damage. But you can really make a case for either of these. You use Cinderace Gmax because it's a luxury with Cinderace. You don't use it because it's a really good Gmax. It's just a good Pokemon that's attached to another good Pokemon. So I'm going to put them both pretty even. You could change either one. Cold Gmax, another S tier Pokemon, but I'm going to put it below Arceus. I'm going to put it above Arceus Fire. This is a really good Pokemon as far as VGC goes, but it's not some meta definer like Zard Gmax is. It's a Pokemon, though, that as far as VGC goes, it's one of those very few Gmaxes that people actually do consider running. It's really just Cinderace because it's Cinderace, Rillaboom because it's Rillaboom, Venusaur because it's Vine Lash, but it's still slightly worse as a Gmax than Zard because typically if you're running both on the same team, you're going to max a Zard. Zard because it's terrifying. I see the niche Blastoise here and there. And then the only other one that I personally really run into is Colossal. And Colossal is still one of those really terrifying Gmax forms. Volcarona is basically just Charizard's max move. But I think the difference is that Cole does need another teammate to pop it into as threatening of a position as it can be. However, if you do pair this with a Pokemon like, let's say, Aqua Jet Sneasel, for example, which is a really common one early on, you can make this into one of the best Pokemon in the format, in my personal opinion. However, it does take a lot to pop it, considering the fact that you do need to dedicate a second team slot to make this work. And unlike something like a Charizard, which that second team slot is a top tier Pokemon, typically you're pairing this with a really weak water type user. So I think at the same time that Cole does take a lot more off of the potential for a team, whereas a Groudon, you're typically bringing that to any game you bring any Pokemon to, really, anyway. Groudon's not a Pokemon you'd really consider benching in most matchups, so I think that with that in mind, Zard just take a lot less out of a team to run that. Colossal, on the other hand, I'm going to give this a D, but I'm going to give it better than, like, Houndoom, Typhlosion even. I'm actually going to put it above Hisuian Arcanine. And while I will admit that I know that Colossal isn't some massive, you know, singles Pokemon or anything, at the same time, it's still not, like, horseshit with boots. And I think it's better than stuff like the Hisuian Arcanine, Typhlosion, etc. And not only this, but I do think with nothing else, Colossal does still, in base form, even provide a nice presence in OU. Not in OU, in VGC, considering the fact that you could still run base Colossal. However, why would you? I still think at the very least, this has one role it does better. It's also not a terrible hazard setter as far as like dual hazards go, but it's not great. Next up is Centiskorch. Centiskorch is not terrible. Again, it's another one of those like low tier Pokemon. I'm gonna put this at least above Pyroar, below Mortar, and fucking Turtonator. Now, as far as the max move for Centiskorch goes, this is basically just Fire Spin. It's not a great move, to be honest. It's actually a pretty terrible max Pokemon. So I think the fact that it's maxed alone does give it viability, and it does have some weird things it checks, like Zacian, for example, because it's actually pretty good resist to everything. So I'll put it in D tier. I'm actually gonna put it above regular Cole. I'm gonna put it above regular Cole. It's a very niche Gmax. In fact, actually, I mixed these up. Centiskorch goes here, Gmax goes here. But basically, though, it's really just meant to be a Zacian check, and that's really all it can do. But that is something, actually. And the Flame Body on it is pretty nice, because you could actually burn Zacian that way. And you take, like, no damage from really any of Zacian's common attacks. But it's such a niche thing that I really cannot rate it higher than D tier. But what do you guys think of the tier list? Let me know what your thoughts are down below. And if you disagree, let me know. If you enjoy this tier list, though, and you want to see more like it, comment down below the type you want to see next, and leave a like on the video. Likes obviously show that you enjoyed the video. And subscribe for more content. With that said, I'll see you guys later. Peace out, guys.